All right, so we're recording it. And what I'm also going to do is send you a link to the recording, okay, in case something gets missed. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you and I'm going to write on it. Now, if I were you, I'd be like copying down some stuff that I write down, okay? So you can just sit there like a, nodding the log if you want to, but I'm just saying that's not going to bode well next Thursday night. So this is like you being in class, okay? So make sure that we're clear that this thing covers chapters 1 through 5. Okay, here we go. All right. So the test covers chapters 1 through 5. All right. So let's talk about chapter 1 first. Now, chapter 1 is mostly vocabulary. So you have to know all of that vocabulary. It's going to be on your test. It might be fill in the blank. It might be true, false. It's never matching. Okay. So you have to know the definitions of things like a sample space. A sample space is all the items, that are possible. So the sample space of rolling a die would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's an actual list. You've got to know that a sample is a subset of a population. You've got to know all those different kinds of sampling: random, systematic, stratified, cluster, convenience, because I might give you a scenario and say, what kind of sampling is that? Or I might just say, what's the definition of random sample? Okay. So remember, random sample means everything's got the same chance of getting picked. It's the best kind and the hardest kind to do. Remember, systematics, where you're picking like every 5th thing in the list or every 142nd thing in the list. Now, the ones people get confused are cluster and systematic because both of them deal with groups. But cluster means that some whole groups are picked and some whole groups are skipped for your study. All right. But stratified means that some of every group is picked and some of every group is missed. So stratified and cluster are the ones people get confused. So just make sure you go back and look at that. Make sure you go back and remember about qualitative and quantitative data. Remember, quantitative are numbers like your IQ, your weight, your ACT score. Qualitative are non-numerical, like your gender, maybe your hair color, your religious affiliation. Make sure you know the difference between discrete and continuous. Make sure that you know your levels of measurement, like nominal, interval, ordinal, and ratio. Okay? So there's a whole bunch of vocabulary in chapter 1. So you've got to be able to know the definitions and apply those definitions. All right? So when you watch that video, you should have taken notes. When you did the reading, you should have taken notes. So if you've got questions, does anybody have a question about something in chapter 1 about the vocabulary that you need some clarification on? Are we good? Okay, now chapter 2 were frequency tables and graphs. Now, you've got to be able to answer questions off a frequency table. All right. So I might give you a frequency table already made. Okay. Maybe this one goes from 15 to 18, and then 19 to 21, and then 23 to 24. All right. No, it's not 24. Let's see what it'd be. It'll be 20. Let's see. That'd be 19. So 4. So it'll be 22. This would be 23 to 26. Let me erase that and fix it real quick. Okay. Okay. All right. All right, say this was my frequency table. I might ask you, what's the class width? All right, so remember, you do not subtract horizontally. When you're doing class width of a table that's already made, you subtract vertically. So the difference between 19 and 15 is 4. And it's got to be the same for the whole table. The difference between 26 and 22 is also 4. So if it's not the same for the whole table, your table's wrong. Okay, so make sure you can find class width of a table. Make sure that you can find the midpoint of the classes. So remember, if I ask you, what's the midpoint of, say, the first class? Remember, you have to take your lower limit and your upper limit, and you have to add them, and then you divide by 2. Okay? So when I add 15 to 18, I'm going to get 33. And when I divide that by 2, I get 16 and a half. That's my midpoint. So make sure that you can find midpoints of classes. Sometimes you get decimals, sometimes you get whole numbers. Okay? Now, the ones that people tend to get confused are limits and boundaries. Okay? So there's a difference, like if this is question A and that's question B, there's a difference if I ask you, what's the lower limit of, say, the second class, versus I ask you, what's the lower boundary of the second class? Those are two different questions. Okay? So there's a difference between a limit and a boundary. And if you get them confused, you won't get any partial credit. Limits are the numbers that are just sitting there. So if I look at my second class, that's this 19 to 22, the lower is the smaller and the upper is the larger. So the lower limit of the second class would be 19. Okay? Now, remember, boundaries take more work. So remember what you do to get the boundaries. You look at the end of class 1, and you look at the beginning of class 2, and you find the difference. Difference means you subtract. All right? Once you get that difference, then you have to divide it by 2. This is the number that you add to these upper limits and subtract from these lower limits to get the boundaries. So if you take that 0.5 and add it to 18, you'd get 18.5. If you took that 0.5 and added to 22, you'd get 22.5. Then you'd get 26.5. Now you subtract that number from the lower limits. So 15 minus 0.5 is 14.5. And 19 minus 0.5 is 18 and 5/10. And 23 minus it would be 22 and 5/10. So lower means smaller. So what's the smaller boundary of the second class? Well, here's my second class. The upper boundary is 22.5, but I asked for the lower boundary. So that answer would be 18.5. So if you need to go back and review how you get boundaries, then you need to do that. Okay? So you've got to be able to find like class width, you got to be able to find midpoints, you got to be able to find limits, you got to be able to find boundaries. So you got to be able to answer questions off of a frequency table. All right? You've also got to be able to make a frequency table from a list of numbers. So make sure that you can make one. So if I gave you like 18 and 14 and 9 and 27 and 36 and 20 and another 18 and an 11 and a 30. So you got to be able to take a list of numbers and make a frequency table. And sometimes I'll say something like, make a table with 3 classes. Sometimes instead I'll say make a table whose first class is 5 to 15. So I can phrase it different ways, and if I phrase it differently, it's done differently. And again, supposedly you had problems out of the book that dealt with those, and then you can go back and rewatch the video if you don't remember how to do it. Okay, so make sure that you can make a frequency table and you can answer questions off of a frequency table. Now, does anybody have a question about answering the questions or making one? Everybody okay? Now, the other thing I said in chapter 2 were graphs. There are actually 5 different kinds of graphs that you might have to make on your test. All right, I'm not going to ask you to make all 5 types, but you won't know which of the 5 I'm going to ask. So you've got to be prepared to make any graph. So one kind of graph that you've got to make is something called a histogram. So when I say histogram in the video, it told you the 2 words that should pop in your head are bar graph. So you've got to be able to make a histogram. Another graph you've got to be able to make is a frequency polygon. And when you hear frequency polygon, the 2 words should pop in your head are line graph. Now, for both of those, you have to have a frequency table. And for a histogram, on the horizontal scale, it uses the boundaries. And on the frequency polygon, on the horizontal scale, it uses the midpoints. So if you put the wrong thing on the horizontal scale, it'll get counted off. Okay, so histogram's the bar graph, and the bars touch when you use the boundaries. If the bars don't touch, then you're not doing it right. Okay, on a frequency polygon, you got to remember to connect the 2 endpoints down to the horizontal scale. All right, a third kind of graph you've got to be able to make is called a circle graph. I think your book calls it a pie chart. And it also starts with a frequency table. So the first 3, you have to have a frequency table to make them. Now, when you're doing your scratch work on the circle graph, I have to see what your angle measures are. And I also have to see your percents. If I don't see those in your scratch work, I'm going to count off. And then inside the pieces of pie, so on the actual picture, you got to put your class in every piece of pie. Put the classes in the pieces. So what that means is if you had a circle graph over here, maybe your first class was about 45 degrees, and then this was the class 10 to 14. And then maybe the next one was like 40 degrees, so it's a little bit smaller. I can't draw it straight very well. Maybe this one was 15 to 19. So you're putting your classes inside your piece of pie. I will go to your scratch work and see what degree measure you thought you were drawing right there and what percent you think that is. Okay. Then you've also got to be able to do a stem and leaf plot. Now that does not start with a frequency table. Okay. And then the last graph actually comes out of chapter 3, and that's a box plot. Okay. Now remember, in a box plot, you need 5 particular numbers. You need your minimum, you need your maximum, you need your median, you need Q1, and you need Q3. Okay. So again, this is just review. You're supposed to know how to make all 5 of these graphs. So if you don't, you have to go back and rewatch videos and figure it out. Come see me. I'll be happy to show you how to do it one-on-one. Now, once again, I'm probably not going to ask you to do all 5, but you won't know which 5 I'm going to ask. Okay, so you got to be prepared to do any or all of those. Okay. So that covers chapter 1 and chapter 2 about your problem types. Okay, so before I go to chapter 3, does anybody have a question right now? Okay. All right. All right, now we're going to do chapter 3. All right. Chapter 3 is where it started getting real, what we think of as kind of mathy. A lot of calculator, a lot of computation. Okay. So with chapter 3, you have to know your measures of center. Okay. So your measures of center are mean, mode, median, and mid-range. Remember, a mean is when you add all the numbers up and divide by how many there are. Remember, mode is the piece of data that occurs most often. Okay. Median is the number in the middle when the list is in order. And remember, mid-range is when you take your high and your low and you add them and divide by 2. So I'm just going to do, if I had a 3 and a 2 and a 9 and another 3 and a 6 and a 10 and another 9. And I said, what's your mean? All right. If I did the mean, I would take all of those numbers and I would add them all up. Okay. If I wanted mode, the number that occurs most often, there are 2 3s and 2 9s. So my mode would be 3 and 9. Now you can have more than one mode, but it cannot be every number. If every number in that list occurred twice, I would write the word no mode. Okay. Median, I'd have to put the numbers in order first. So I'd have like a 2 and a 3 and a 3 and a 6 and a 9 and a 9 and a 10. So when I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that means that that number is in the middle. So my median would be 6. If there were 2 numbers in the middle, I would add them and divide by 2. And then mid-range remembers when you take the high and the low and you add them and divide by 2. Okay, so make sure you can do your measures of center. Then make sure that you can do your measures of variation. All right, and your measures of variation are range, standard deviation, and variance. Okay. Remember, range is just your high minus your low. Now, I want to make sure we're clear. I said this in the video, but let me show you how people get confused. Range sounds a lot like mid-range. They're close enough to be dangerous because both of them use the high and the low. But one time I add them and one time I subtract them and one time I divide by 2 and one time I don't. So when I think mid-range, I think mid. How do you get a midpoint? You add 2 numbers and divide by 2. Standard deviation, your calculator will do the standard deviation of a list of numbers, but you've got to know where to go and what to type in. Okay. And then variance is just your standard deviation squared. So if the calculator, just make sure if you're using the calculator, that make sure that here you always choose on the TI something called SX. but you're going to write S, not SX. SX is a TI notation. So don't grab sigma, grab S. So if you want to get variance, say your S was 1.2 when you rounded it, then variance would be that number squared, which is about 1.44. Okay. Then make sure you can do your measures of variation. I mean, your measures of, excuse me, relative standing. So that means you've got to be able to do things like, z-scores. It also means you've got to be on that formula's on your sheet, but it's in a weird place. It's under like chapter 6. Make sure that you round z-scores to the hundredths. Most of the time, I don't care where you round. Okay. Then make sure that you can find percentile when given a number. So that would, I would something like this. I would say something like, what percentile is 3 in the list? So when you're given a number, make sure you can find the percentile. Or I might go the other way. Given the percentile, find the number. Okay. So that would be more like find piece of 30. Okay. So make sure you can do all of that out of chapter 3. Now, while I'm thinking about it, I want to make sure we're clear. Most people like partial credit. Okay. So, but it's got to go both ways. If I give you partial credit for what's right, that means I've also got to take off partial credit for what's wrong. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is this. Okay. Sometimes somebody will do this on their test. I will have asked them to come down here and find me like the mid-range. And so they take their biggest number and they take their smallest number and they add them and they write down 12. And then they go, okay, divided by 2, and then they write down 6. I'm going to have to count it wrong. Equals does not mean here comes my next step. Equals means they are equivalent mathematically. And you just told me that 10 plus 2 equals 6. 10 plus 2 doesn't equal 6. So what you could have done was said 10 plus 2 is 12, and then somewhere else said 12 divided by 2 is 6. That'd be okay. Or you could have come over here and said 10 plus 2 divided by 2 is 12 divided by 2, and 10 plus 2 divided by 2 is 6. So you've got to, don't just string stuff together with equals that are not equal. Okay. So you have to be able to do all that to like a list of numbers. You got to be able to find me the mean, the mode, the median, the mid-range, the range, the standard deviation, the variance, the z-score for like the number 6. What percentile is 3, and find me piece of 30. All from a list of numbers. Okay. So make sure you can do every one of those things. Okay. Now, does anybody have a question about something?
In one of the videos that you had, there was at the end of it, there was like a little bell curve, and I think it was
Yes.
normal distribution.
Yes.
Will that be on this section?
Yes, it will be. Okay, so I'm fixing to write something else. Is any question on this so far? Okay, now the other thing that you've got to have, let's do this. This will be quicker. The other thing out of chapter 3, all right, is what Natalie just said. Before I do that, let me say this real quick before I forget. Also, make sure that you can find me the mean and standard deviation of a frequency table. Now, those formulas are on your formula sheet. So all you got to be able to do is copy the formulas off the sheet, but you've got to know what every symbol stands for. Now, all the other things a minute ago were from a list of numbers. But if I give you a frequency table, in addition to like answering questions off of it, like what's the width and what's the midpoint of the second class, I might say, what's the mean of that table? Or what's the standard deviation of that table? So make sure that you can do that. Okay. Now, what Natalie's talking about that frequency table, what you have to know basically for your thing, you have to know those percentages. Okay. All data is not normally distributed, but more is than you would think. So if you take your mean and you subtract one standard deviation and you take your mean and you add one standard deviation, 68% of your data, of your values are going to fall between those two numbers. And I think the example in the video told you that the average IQ was 100 and the standard deviation was 15. So what that means is if I take that 100 and I add a 15, and I take that 100 and I subtract a 15, that's why 68% of people have an IQ between 85 and 115. If you take the mean and you subtract 2 standard deviations, and you take the mean and you add 2 standard deviations, 95% of your data is going to go between those two numbers. So now you remember you multiply before you add. So if I say 2 times 15 and get 30, when I add that to my 100, I'd get 130. Down here, I'd end up with a 70. So 95% of people have an IQ between 70 and 130. Now, you don't have to memorize the IQ and the standard deviation. You've got to memorize the percentages. So you've got to know that 95% of data is within 2 standard deviations on a normal curve. Okay? Within 3 standard deviations is 99.7%. So 99.7% is going to be between those two numbers. So the other video, the PowerPoint's a little easier to write, okay? And it's kind of color-coded, and so is the book, okay? Now, what you also need to know is if you take your mean and you add 2 standard deviations, and you take your mean and you subtract 2 standard deviations, the data between those two numbers is considered to be usual. So that means that a usual IQ score would be between my mean plus 2 standard deviations. So you understand that that means 100 plus 2 times 15. So that's 130. This would be 100 minus 2 times 15. So 100 minus 30 is 70. So a usual IQ would be any IQ between 70 and 130. Unusual would be above this number or below that number. Okay, so if it's bigger than the mean plus 2 standard deviations, or if it's smaller than the mean minus 2 standard deviations, that's considered to be unusual. So an IQ of like 140 would be unusual. Now, the mean and standard deviation are not always going to be 115. So women's weights are also normally distributed, but we all know the average weight of a woman's not 100 pounds. Okay, so these percentages don't change, these values change. But you would take whatever the mean was and whatever the standard deviation was, and you would plug it in right there. you would take whatever the mean is and whatever the standard deviation is and plug it in right there. And if you're between those two numbers, it's usual. If you're above this number, it's unusual. It's unusually high. If you're below this number, it's unusually low. Okay. And Z-scores, remember, tell you how many standard deviations you are from the mean. So some people would rather think about it like this. All right. If your Z-score then is bigger than 2.00, that's unusual. Or if your Z-score is less than a negative 2.00, that would be unusual. So some people prefer to get the actual numbers, like bigger than 130 or smaller than 70. That makes more sense to them. Some people would rather take the Z-score, take the number and do the Z-score and check the Z-scores. That's up to you. But I'm going to ask you on your test if something's usual or unusual. So make sure you're able to do that. Did that help your, Natalie? Did that kind of answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, you're so welcome. Does anybody else have a question? And that kind of ends chapter 3. Okay. Now I'm going to outline chapters 4 and 5 together. Okay. Now, chapters 4 and 5, one thing I can ask you is to find a probability. Now, if you haven't finished chapter 5, this may not make a lot of sense. Okay. If I ask you to find a probability, there are 3 types. One thing, one time. Connector words. And the connector words that I went over are or, and given that. And then binomial. Okay. So if I ask you to find a probability, you've got to decide which of those types you have. So remember, if it's one thing, one time, on the bottom is your total. And on the top is what's in the parenthesis. Now, I said this in the video, but I want to be clear. Every time I ask you to find a probability, I better see a P, and then in words, what you're trying to find the probability of. Like getting blue marble. Or picking queen, etc. If I don't see that when it's a probability, I won't give you any partial credit, because people that don't write enough words miss them. Now, the formula for or and are on your formula sheet. So make sure you copy the formula sheet. Binomial, your calculator does all the work, but you've got to know where to go and what to type in. Okay? All right. So I might ask you to find a probability. Now, another thing I might ask you to do this, I might ask you to find odds. And odds and probability are not the same thing. Odds have to have 2 numbers in the answer. So it might look like this, 3 to 1. You could also write it 3 over 1, but don't just put 3. Okay. Now, there are 2 kinds of odds. There are odds against, and there are odds in favor. So anytime it says find the odds, I know I've got to have the probability that something will happen, and I've got to have the probability that something will not happen. every time. So if they want the odds against getting a red marble, I've got to have the probability I will get a red marble and the probability I will not get a red marble. So I'm going to have two fractions, and I'm going to put one fraction on top of the other fraction and simplify. You can't have decimals when you're doing odds. Okay. So you end up with two numbers. Okay. If it's odds against, will not goes on the top. If it's odds in favor, will goes on the top. Okay. So make sure that you don't get odds and complements confused. Okay. Another thing you've got to be able to do on your midterm is find a total. How many committees can you make from 10 people if you put 3 people on the committee? How many ways can you line 5 children up at the door to go to lunch? How many secret codes can you make with certain conditions? Okay, so the key thing on find a total is going to ask you how many. And there are 3 ways to do that. Counting principle, permutations, and combinations. Now remember, on the counting principle, order matters. On permutation, order matters. On combinations, order does not matter. So if order does not matter, you have to use combinations. Like if you're picking a committee, it doesn't matter what order the committee's picked. It's the same committee. And your calculator does all the work on combinations. If order does matter, you've narrowed it down to the counting principle and permutations. If order matters, you can always use the counting principle. So if you're confused about should I use the counting principle or permutations, use the counting principle. And that's when you start drawing those blanks. You never have to actually use permutations. So the counting principle works when you have replacement or no replacement, repetition or no repetition. The counting principle works when you have special conditions or no special conditions, so it's more versatile. But the calculator won't do all the work on that one. Okay. Another thing it asks you to do is it asks you to find the mean and standard deviation. And sometimes it was a probability distribution table. And sometimes it was a binomial problem. So make sure you can do that. So make sure that you understand this, and I'm gonna write it down in a second after you make sure you get that down. The way you know if you've got a probability distribution table, it looks kind of like a frequency table, except you've got X and P of X, and you have to have numbers under the X. And these probabilities have to add up to 1. Okay. So sometimes it looks like a probability table and it's not. If these probabilities don't add to 1, it's not a probability distribution table. So make sure that you can find me the mean and standard deviation of a probability distribution table. That's section 5.1. Section 5.2 is binomial problems. And on binomial, there are 2 things on your calculator. Let's make sure we're clear. There's a binomial PDF key, and there's a binomial CDF key. You got to make sure you know when to use which one. The P key is when there's X is one number. just a 3, just a 25. The C key is used when you have a list that starts with 0 for X. Because C stands for cumulative. Okay, so C stands for cumulative. All right, so make sure you know when to use the P key and when to use the C key. And the order you type thing in matters if you have an old calculator like mine. All right, like on my calculator, it's old. The new ones are better, but I'm too cheap to buy one. So on mine, when I'm doing like binomial PDF, I've got to type in my N and then my P and then my X. If I type them out of order, it's going to give me an error message. So maybe my total is 12 and my probability is 0.3 and my X is a 7. I'd have to type it that way. Now, some of you on the newer ones, if it says number of trials, that would be your 12. Number of successes would be your 7. So, you know, with your menu. Okay. Now, some of these things, I don't want you to get mixed up. And here's what I mean by mixed up. So we understand that it's going to ask you to find the mean, standard deviation, if I could write, and variance. All right, so it might be a list of numbers. All right, that's chapter 3. But you can see if there's a list of numbers, then you do it that way. It might be a frequency table. So if it's a list of numbers, you can use the calculator. If it's a frequency table, you have to use the formula on the sheet. It might be it might be a probability distribution table. And again, if it is, you've got to use the formula on the sheet. And they're different formulas. There's not really any way to get these confused because if it's a probability table, there are decimals on the right column. If it's a frequency table, there are not decimals on the right column. A binomial problem is a word problem. You don't see a list of numbers and you don't see a table. It's got to be binomial. And again, the formula is on the sheet. So even though I can ask you to find the mean of lots of things, there's not really any way to get them mixed up if you've done your homework and studied. Because if you're looking at a list of numbers, you know what to do. You know, you should know where to go on the calculator, how to enter your numbers in a list, how to go to stat, how to go to one variable stats, how to type it in and hit enter, and what to pick. You shouldn't get a frequency table confused with a probability distribution table. Because a frequency table's got classes over here like 10 to 14, 15 to 19, and whole numbers. A probability table has single values over here and then decimals over here. So there's no way they look alike. And they're different formulas and they're on the sheet. And one of them says frequency table next to it and one says probability distribution next to it. Okay? And then if it's none of those, it's got to be a binomial problem. And again, those formulas are on the sheet. Now, there's also vocabulary in chapters 4 and 5. So you've got to know that vocabulary. You've got to know that probability is always a number between blank and blank, 0 and 1. You've got to know when something is impossible, the probability is 0. When it's certain to happen, if it's always going to happen, the probability is 1. So the reason probability is always between 0 and 1 is everything in life is somewhere between never and always. Now with probabilities, I want at least 3 decimal places. And you cannot round to 0 and you cannot round to 1. So if your probability came out to be like this on your calculator, you couldn't just round and say the probability is 0, because that would imply it was impossible, and it's not impossible. You could round that to a 4 and stop. So you can round to 3 or 4 places as long as you're not rounding to 0 or 1. If it rounds to 0 or 1, you got to go further out. You've got to know that independent events are events that do not affect each other. Dependent events, they do affect each other. You've got to know that mutually exclusive events that cannot happen at the same time, like a spade and a red card. One card can't be a spade and a red. Okay? Before you grab that and formula, make sure that you ask yourself, is it possible? Because if it's not possible, you don't grab that and formula. The answer is just 0. Like if I said, what's the probability that you get a red card and a spade if I let you pick one card? I do not go do the probability of red times the probability of a spade. I just know the answer is 0. Because if you got one card, it cannot be a red and a spade. But if I say, what's the probability that you get a red and a spade, and I let you pick 2 cards, well, now that is possible. Then you go grab the formula on the sheet, which says it's the probability of the first one times the probability of the second one. And make sure you understand, if I say with replacement, that means every time you pick, you record what you got, but then you put it back before you pick again. If I say without replacement, that means once you pick it, you keep it. It's not going back. So then every time you pick, there are less things in your total. Okay, so make sure that you read. There's a lot of reading on this test. You've got to read very, very carefully. Okay. Now, does anybody have a question about chapters 4 or 5? Okay. Then what I'm going to do is stop sharing this screen. Okay. Now, I have kind of outlined everything that's going to be on your test. And again, when you come next Thursday night, you bring your student ID. You can print that formula sheet off and write anything on the back of it that you want to, but do not write on the front. And I don't even care. You can write a prayer to Jesus on the back. I don't care what you write on the back. Okay. That's for you. You get to decide what you want to put on the back of your sheet. That's just your outline, your memory tricks, your calculator steps, whatever you want to write, and then make sure that got your calculator and a pencil. You don't want to be taking that test in pen, because you're going to make mistakes on it and have to erase. But don't forget to study the vocabulary, or that's going to drop at a letter grade, because there's a good bit of vocabulary on there. Okay? So logistically, does everybody understand what's going to be on that test? We good? Now, so what's going to happen now is this. I'm going to let you go. Okay, so if you don't have a question, all right, then you are free to leave. Natalie, I know you said you had a question, and Jed, I told you to stay on for a minute. So I know those two are going to stay. Anybody else is welcome to stay or leave. But if you need me, just let me know, and I'm happy to help you anytime. Okay, so if you're going, feel free to go. All right. Let me give them a chance to leave if they want to leave. I'm going to take Jet out. Okay, now. All right. Madeline, did you have a question?
No, ma'am. I was just going to listen to other people's
Okay.
questions.
Santa, did you have a particular question?
No, I was gonna stay because it was about the question on chapter 5, and then I had another
Okay.
one.
Natalie, I know you have a question, right? All right, tell me
Sam.
what yours is.
So with the compliments, I know that in the videos and a lot of the examples in the textbook, it says at least one. But then one of the problems for chapter 5, I can't remember which one it was, but it said at least 8.
Okay.
Um,
So let me show you something real quick. And then if that doesn't clear it up, we'll do it again. Okay. I'm gonna share my screen for a second again. All right. Let me do this. I'm gonna stop recording. Okay.